Welcome to the Project Schola Podcast, brought to you by the Philos-Sophia Initiative Foundation, breaking through the barrier of scientific belief. I'm your host, Brian Murphy, along with co-host Trevor Berger of the Philos-Sophia Initiative. We're here to talk about the work of Professor Wolfgang Smith and his foundation, the Philos-Sophia Initiative. The Philos-Sophia Initiative aims to facilitate a transformative impact upon our civilization through the recovery of the vertical aspect of cosmic reality based upon the philosophical and scientific discoveries of Wolfgang Smith. The initiative proposes a dynamic outreach to minds profoundly committed to truth, inviting them to an encounter with a comprehensive worldview that integrates the fundamental discoveries of physics into the perennial wisdom of mankind. Now, Wolfgang just completed his latest book, Physics, A Science in Quest of an Ontology, available now at Philos-Sophia.org. That's philos-sophia.org. You want to get this book. It's $19.95 for the paperback and $35.95 for the hardcover. That's Physics, A Science in Quest of an Ontology, available now at philos-sophia.org. So the Philos-Sophia Initiative really focuses on the central claim of contemporary physics, which is attempting a theory of everything. And the theory of everything is that the cosmos and everything in it reduces to what we call fundamental particles. And this is essentially what we might call the reductionist proposition, that everything reduces to fundamental particles. And so what Wolfgang Smith has shown is that this claim is not only inconsistent really with the findings of quantum theory, quantum physics, but that it is not a scientifically established fact as much as it is a scientistic claim, which is a belief. And so this belief is what leaves the field of physics in a state of a perpetual enigma, unable to truly understand quantum theory. Wolfgang likes to quote often Richard Feynman that no one understands quantum theory. So what does this matter to you, the layperson going about your life, going to work, paying the bills, educating your kids? Well, because as a friend of ours liked to say, culture lies downstream of physics. In other words, contemporary physics, contemporary science presents us with a worldview that we are told is scientific, but it isn't. It's scientistic. So, John, what's scientism? What are we talking about?
It's an interesting question because, of course, some would say it's a very simple question, but I would begin to answer by simply saying that I think that a lot of people have what I've come to understand is a very reduced understanding of what scientism means. And it's something I certainly used to see it as. Essentially, the assumption that all questions are ultimately answerable by the empiriological sciences. Empiriological meaning empirical and theoretic. So you have empirical testing and you have mathematical theory involved in science, in empiriological science. Now, this is actually one of the things you learn studying Wolfgang is that scientism is really much more broad than this. This is really just an aspect of scientism. Scientism, in the sense he uses it, is basically what you said. It's an ideology, really. In some ways, it's kind of a pseudo-religion. I mean, science with a capital S, and it puts on this, one of the a good example of this is like when people say, well, the science is not debatable. Or they say, like, in a lot of psychology articles you see, they'll say this, that, and the other thing. They'll say, but what does the science say? Let's look at the science. And really what they mean is data.
Or what they're saying is, this is what are the scientists saying, but the scientists aren't always offering the science. They're offering their ideological presuppositions drawing from empirical studies, but not really offering what the science tells us, but offering what they think. We can draw conclusions from that scientific study.
Absolutely.
So an example of that, the central tenet is what is this reductionist or reductionism, right? That everything reduces to quantum particles, to things. But as soon as you do that, you run into the problems of, what are these little things that we're talking about, quantum particles? What are they made of? And so what constitutes, you might say it's matter, but what is matter? And now you're running into really fundamental issues of the nature of reality. And uh, and this is why it brings quantum physics into focus, because quantum physics is the science of measurement. And as soon as you start measuring things at that level, the measurement problem reveals to us that measurement can't actually tell us what the nature of reality is. Is that a
Yeah,
correct
one
statement?
thing I would just clarify. You mentioned quantum physics is the science of measurement. Physics as a whole is the science of measurement.
That's true. Yeah. So when you say, John, that trust the science, what we're really saying is trust what the scientists are saying. But what the scientists are giving us is sort of an ideological presuppositions on top of the empirical findings. And so you might even use a similar parallel. You often hear this discussion that it's an antagonism between science and religion. But in fact, religion, for example, doesn't make any claims about science one way or the other, the scientific method. It's kind of agnostic about science, but there is an opposition between scientism and religion, because scientism represents an ideological presupposition, and religion represents its own presuppositions about, and both present a nature of reality that are at odds with one another. Now, you might even say that scientism opposes not just religion, but science itself, because you have reputable empiricists, reputable scientists actually proposing that we discard with certain methods of science, namely Popperian falsification. Why? Well, because it doesn't match their ideological presuppositions, is what Wolfgang calls the Procrustean notion. Well, the observations don't match my ideological presuppositions, so let's change the laws of physics. Let's change uh, the scientific method because it doesn't match how we want it to look. Now, we don't need to make this a religious discussion or anything like that, but what we're seeing here, what we're pointing out, is that when often we're talking about what does the science say, a science offers us a view of the world that is quite often not empirical, but ideological, and at odds not just with the other prevailing worldviews, but with science itself.
Well, here's the thing. I think, when you talk about what does the science say, I mean, I think there's what we would call a reification of science, in this sense of that's kind of what scientism is sort of
What was the
a
word you used?
reification, meaning, making it a thing as opposed to what it really is, which is a set of procedures, depending on of empirical methods and procedures and um, modus operandi comes into play when you're engaging in some kind of empirical inquiry. In other words, science is not dogmatic. And I think that scientism is such a kind of dogmatism, or a
Right.
scientistic outlook. It involves that kind of a knee
Well, it
jerk.
offers a worldview.
Yeah, yeah, and a sort of knee jerk reaction against anything that would say otherwise. And I agree, and you're right about there is no the debate, but the so-called debate or conflict between science on one side and religion on the other side. Well, really, no. It's more like there's science and religion on one side, each having their own purview, versus scientism to core on the other side, which is a sort of a religious building up of science.
It makes certain presuppositions that try to impose itself on the scientific method. So if you say, well, what does the
Sure.
science say? Scientism. Well, scientism usually comes from scientists, not to say that who are who perform science, but they're giving us their ideas, um, which in and of themselves may not be wrong.
Really, what you've got is science and religion who are not at odds with each other on one side versus scientism on the other, which pretends to be both a science and unspokenly, unconsciously, science is made a religion of. in scientism. Of course, Wolfgang calls this the new Gnosticism, neo-Gnosticism, which
Right.
is a sort of a counter religion. So,
Right. That's a big topic.
and well, it's a big topic in itself, right?
And so,
So
so really the question it comes down to is like, why does this matter? Why does anyone need to know this stuff?
yeah, for my part, I'm interested in things because I'm interested in them. I think I guess that's sort of the philosopher's curse in a way, is to be interested in things without, with no practical, regardless of it not having any practical application. But people need to understand it because they're imbibing a lot of what they think is science, which of itself is not a thing really. It's a collection and collation of procedures and methods and whatnot, and they're sort of conflating that with a false picture of reality, and really it's all predicated on these fallacious assumptions. Of course, the first one of these is bifurcation. And what is bifurcation? Bifurcation is coined by Alfred North Whitehead, used very much by Wolfgang Smith, refers to how Rene Descartes introduced a cutting asunder between extension and thought.
So, John, let's take a step back here. We're talking about scientism. You introduced the notion of bifurcation. So, and this goes back to really what Wolfgang's making the point is that for the past 400 years, essentially, Western civilization has taken a turn away from a certain way of viewing the cosmos as transcendent and vertical to one in which the cosmos is flat and horizontal. We'll get into what we mean by vertical and horizontal. But you're saying it really came to a head with Rene Descartes, the philosopher and mathematician who introduced a notion that reality is bifurcated, bifurcated meaning split in two. And the two parts of this bifurcation, he was trying to understand in this positivistic sense how he could account for his own existence. So he was really in an existential crisis, right? The point is that he assumed that reality splits into two. One was res extensae, those things that are extended in space, meaning objects, ordinary objects, right? I go to the post office box. The post office box is an object extended in space. So I can objectively recognize that this post office box is there. And then there are res cogitantes, things of the mind, things that are not extended in space, but I could say objectively they exist. You might say thoughts, emotions, other qualities. And so the res cogitantes informs what I know about the res extensae. I know the box is there, the mailbox is there, because I have res cogitantes that informs me that the box is there. So really what this is saying is that you're viewing the world through a subjective lens, that you know the objective world is there because subjectively you can see that it's there. But of course, this poses the problem. Well, now you've just created a subjective world. And so the world only essentially just exists in your mind. And so we've inherited this is called the Cartesian from René Descartes, bifurcation, the world split in two between res extensa and res cogitantes. So we all believe, essentially, the prevailing myth of today is we are matter, stuff, with consciousness, roaming around, subjectively interpreting the world. And so this informs both psychology and physics, the way we do physics, and as a result informs our entire view of reality. And what Wolfgang is saying, essentially, by pointing this out, and as you mentioned, it was coined bifurcation by Alfred North Whitehead. Essentially, it's a fallacious presupposition because it ignores a certain aspect of our reality. Doesn't it reduce mind or the person to essentially just something that reasons? It's almost as if we're blind. We're going through the world blind, touching, feeling, taking things in through our senses and then interpreting them in our minds and creating a view of the world, well, this leads a person to think like, well, how do I know if anything's real? And so you have people today on social media and blogospheres believing that we live in a simulation, and it challenges their entire view of reality. And I think this informs what we see today so much in the blogosphere as well, called the meaning crisis, because people believe that we're just matter with consciousness. Go ahead, John.
So bifurcation, you could say, substituting the Latin terms, is a division of reality into two substances, thought and extension. And what Descartes really did here was place a priority, you could say an ontic priority, upon extension. And what is characteristic of extension?
By the ontic, you're talking about ontology. And
Well,
ontology is the study of being, right? The
right.
nature of
Yeah.
being.
So the adjective ontic refers to the existential status of something.
When we're talking about ontology, you're talking about the nature of being.
Right.
So ontology
Right.
is the
So
study of being.
ontic is simply really another word for ontological, you could say. So the ontological priority in the bifurcationist paradigm is on extension, on the extended. And what's characteristic of the extended is that it is quantitative, purely quantitative. So all of the things that we believe that we perceive, like colors and scents and sounds, the scientific paradigm tries to reduce these to, or I should say,
well, you end up in that
bifurcation.
pickle, because where the things you're observing you start to believe are merely illusions of your mind.
Right.
Because if extense is just quantity, then everything that you're perceiving in a qualitative sense in res cogitantes is merely interpreted as an illusion. Well, it must be an illusion, right? If it's just of my mind, if it's my subjective interpretation, then the only thing that objectively exists is the quantitative things that I see. But whatever qualities they have are a creation of my mind.
And this is what makes bifurcation the premise for global totalitarian mathematical physics. Because,
well, it's also lethal to being.
Well, yeah, we'll get to that. But the point is that because, as time goes by, and Wolfgang actually talks about this in his first book, Cosmos and Transcendence, as time went by, thought was swallowed up by extension, because it's like, well, the brain is extended in space. And if the brain is only matter and thought, well, then ultimately everything is extended. So even thought, res cogitantes, become swallowed up by extension. And so now we have brain science, which is trying to understand, quote unquote, consciousness, as if the investigator were not himself a thinker as well.
Right. So I mentioned that, and Wolfgang brings this up, is this bifurcation. We call it the Cartesian bifurcation, or Alfred North Whitehead did. That doesn't mean that it was necessarily Descartes' intent was to. He was actually trying to resolve the issue of his own existence, but he was using a fallacious premise, and it comes from this fallacious premise comes from the world of a positivistic science that there is no transcendence. There are only the things that we observe. And so there are things that I can observe, and there are things and I know that I can observe them. And so now we have this duality. And so existence is reduced to, in a sense, a duality. And so everything we have in our modern civilization, modern Western civilization, comes from this bifurcated premise. Whether you're talking about psychology, which assumes that, whether it's Freudian or Jungian, the notion is basically that we come to knowledge through an experience of our environment, right? We go through the world, we touch, we experience physical objects, physical experiences, what actually Wolfgang would call corporeal, and we subjectively interpret them and reason our way through this world to come to a conclusion of how the world is. But ultimately, it's illusory because it's subjective. That is the prevailing notion of that's what you get from bifurcation. But it also works well in physics, right? Because in order to do physics well, we can't concern ourselves with philosophical notions necessarily, because we're really just concerned about quantity. What is its length, width, or classical physics, length, width, breadth, and what time is it in space, right? We're concerned about the three-dimensionality and what time is it in space. That would be classical physics, and how those objects interact in space. So this is reminiscent of Democritus, 5th century BC, where he proposed all there is atoms and the void, right?
And by
Things
convention,
like,
color, the
go
sweet and the
ahead.
bitter, only by convention.
Exactly. So this notion that the color, the sweet, and the bitter are just an illusion of your mind. Now, this was considered a heretical belief. And in fact, I think Wolfgang talks about this, that Plato and the other philosophers disregarded this notion as nonsense because, as you and I had talked previously in other conversations, it's self-evident that you exist. Talk about that for a second.
Well, for one thing, I would say about Descartes is I think that part of his so-called Cartesian doubt, as they call it, part of it is methodological. Our friend in Paris, Bruno Berard, would say that Descartes was not a Cartesian himself, that very much sort of became encrusted into the philosophical tradition, but poor René Descartes, got blamed for a lot of things that weren't his fault. But nevertheless, he is definitely the poster child for that paradigm, because it was that understanding of extension that allowed for a world that's just purely mechanical and makes mathematical physics king. It's sort of Descartes really the good focal point. Now, when it comes to the question of the self-evidence of the senses, what we really come to here is what Wolfgang distinguishes between the physical and the corporeal. So the physical universe is simply the world as conceived by the physicist. And the corporeal world is the world of sensory perception, or cognitive sense perception. And one of the things that that's evident, and you can see philosophers like, say, Etienne Gisson, who argued that the realist in philosophy, this would be realism versus idealism, so to speak, when you're talking about the res cogitans side of the divide. The thing is, the first thing to not do is try to prove realism, because if you do, you're implicitly putting yourself on the idealist ground. The point is that the world that appears to sensory perception is self-evident. As Robert Sokolowski really brilliantly put it,
Sorry, who is Robert Sokolowski?
He's a contemporary philosopher, just about Wolfgang's contemporary, a few years younger, scholar of Edmund Husserl, primarily, and also Aristotle and certain others. I would say that he is the other great living philosopher, in addition to Wolfgang. As he put it, sort of summing up this, he wouldn't call it the corporeal world, but the self-evidence of the world of corporeal things is, things appear as they are, and they are as they appear. And this is sort of a principle of phenomenology, which is a movement in philosophy founded by Edmund Husserl, who has been somewhat of an influence on Wolfgang. And I think that one of the things that Wolfgang talks about in his new book, very briefly, is, essentially there are two ways to the corporeal world, or back to the corporeal world. One is the phenomenological approach, which he used in the Quantum Enigma, I think in a very, very cogent way. And then the other way is what we might call the ecological way, or the ecological approach, which follows upon the work of the cognitive psychologist James Gibson, who surprisingly is a lot more well known than I realized. And Gibson established that the visual image theory, which is a direct descendant from Cartesianism, or the retinal image theory, that the eye works like the way a camera works. Gibson found, well, there's insufficient information on the retina to conduct certain very complex activities.
I want to come back to the notion of Cartesian bifurcation and how essentially it informs our worldview, that makes us believe that everything we look at is a subjective interpretation of the mind, because all we are is matter with consciousness, right? So if that's the case, then, well, if that's wrong, what's the alternative, I guess? And this is where, well, it's important to point out that, first of all, this isn't a scientific finding, right? Because the central premise of, you might say, the central Gnostic belief of our contemporary Western civilization is that everything reduces to matter. Everything is what Wolfgang would say, and I quoted him on this: there are two sciences possible. Science dealing with the sum of parts, which is the contemporary view. Then there is a higher science based on Platonist ontology, and it involves irreducible wholeness. And this is what he talks about in his new book, Physics, a Science in Quest of an Ontology. Now, the larger point here is that you cannot resolve these issues without philosophy. Now, early in Wolfgang's work, in Science and Myth, he penned a chapter, chapter 7, a response to Stephen Hawking's The Grand Design, where Stephen Hawking, in essence, proposed that material reality is all there is, science is the only knowledge we need to have, and philosophy is essentially useless. Now, none of these are scientific fact. In fact, these are metaphysical proclamations on.
Right. It's interesting, and it's terribly ironic with people like him, and I could mention some others. Lawrence Krauss.
He's making a philosophical claim.
Precisely.
Philosophy is not needed.
You beat me to the point. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's, I mean, it's so true.
But the point is, you philosophy. I just wanted to make this point, that the reason why we're having this conversation, why are two lay people here talking about quantum physics? Well, we're not really talking about quantum physics. We're talking about the theory of quantum physics, which delves into the philosophical, the theoretical realm. And it butts up against, it presents a worldview that butts up against a traditional worldview that many of us inherit from our parents and have been passed down thousands of years. And it presents us with a view of reality that just doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't match with our experience. And because, of course, as Wolfgang likes to point out, no one looks at their grandchild and thinks they're hugging a bunch of quantum particles. They think they're actually hugging an actual being. And so if you go back to this Cartesian bifurcation that says, well, there's just matter with consciousness. Well, what in the world is consciousness? No one can tell us that. And so Wolfgang presents essentially his resolution to the quantum enigma, which we'll talk about later, but his this ontology that he gives to physics. He says physics needs an ontology. We need a way of explaining where it comes from and what it means. And so he presents an ontology that is inherently Platonist. And so let's talk about that a little bit, because I want to talk about his idea of the tripartite cosmos, which he represents in this cosmic icon. And I'll just describe it briefly before we talk about it. Namely, is that there are three levels to our reality, not two, not a bifurcated reality between matter and mind, but in fact, and this goes back to the scholastics, is this elimination of the idea of intellect, that there's a distinction between intellect and reason. And lastly, the corporeal, which we need to talk about as well. But essentially, we're corporeal beings that exist in time and space, but we have an aspect to our reality that is rational. It engages in discursive thought that doesn't happen in space, but yet takes up time when you think about something. And yet there's a third level that's been eliminated, that's been forgotten, and that is the intellect. And the intellect is closely related to being, and it is the capacity to perceive, essentially. It doesn't require discursive thought. The fact that I'm looking at my computer right now, I'm not engaging in a rational act. It's instantaneous. And so our existence actually takes place on three levels. It's what he calls the aviternal level. There's no space, no time. This is the intellectual capacity, this ability to immediately perceive. And this relates to what you were talking about James J. Gibson, how we perceive our environment around us. The rational, which is this intermediary realm. And if you look at this from the cosmic icon, And it's so beautiful because Wolfgang relates it to the Euclidean math, which is where the icon comes from. This, which is well, early Pythagorean, you could say. The circle with the center point. The center point, a point has no dimensionality. There's no time, no space. That is, our being proceeds forth from that through an intermediary realm, which takes place in time but not space, and manifests itself, you might say, on the level of the corporeal in space and time. And this is the ontology he's giving us. It actually provides an explanation to everything going on in physics. And so this distinction between intellect and reason is so key to doing away with this bifurcation and understanding that we are in fact transcendent beings manifesting ourselves on the corporeal plane. And well, in fact, you wouldn't say we're transcendent beings, we're tripartite beings, because our corporeal existence is just as important as our aeviternal and intermediary existence.
Yes.
Am I right
yeah,
there?
it's really the really great breakdown of the tripartition. And at one point I would add also is that when you're talking about bifurcation versus tripartition, in bifurcation you have two substances existing side by side, if you will, whereas the tripartition is hierarchical from corporeal, which
Yes.
this is at the bottom, aeviternal, which is at the top, and the intermediary, no surprise there, is intermediate between the two. I would say on this point that there's a really great thing that Wolfgang says in the new book regarding the tripartition. He says, quote, "The aeviternal realm is inherently the cosmos in its integrality before it is fragmented into innumerable bits and pieces through the imposition of temporal and spatial bounds. Temporal bound is imposed by the intermediary, spatial bound is imposed by the corporeal." Continuing, "Yet despite this partition into spatiotemporal fragments, every corporeal entity remains undivided in its very being, in its inner nature. It therefore constitutes an irreducible wholeness." We'll get into irreducible wholeness either later or at another time.
That relates back to exactly how I opened this segment, which was Wolfgang talked about two possible sciences, one dealing with sums of parts, which is the contemporary view that starts from the bottom up, that says, no, matter came first and then consciousness arose out of that. And Wolfgang saying, no, this doesn't work. In fact, this is what quantum physics is showing us. In fact, the higher science is based on a Platonist ontology, and it involves an irreducible wholeness. That in fact, it doesn't bubble up from the bottom, but comes from the top down. So being informs the very matter where we manifest ourselves.
Right.
And so while the scientist might break things into fragmentation, he can't put it back together again.
Right.
You can't reduce everything to parts and then put it back together and find being somewhere, because being doesn't exist. It doesn't arise out of matter. It exists and informs matter. That's Wolfgang's. You could boil it down to that in essence, in a layperson's view.
And I would say, one of the things that the way I tend to put it, in saying that when, Wolfgang says that, really every corporeal object, which I said this, jumping off of what you said, even, we ourselves and really every corporeal object, perceptible, sensible object in the corporeal domain is nevertheless tripartite. It's fragmented. Right. And all things in their essential being, everything has, on pain of not existing, what I call its aeviternal core. That's where the being of a thing derives. If there's not a tripartite participation, you can't have a corporeal being at all.
So John, let me ask you something, because to the ordinary layperson, right, or even let's say the physicist, it might be like, these guys, what are they talking about? They're talking about eternal. It sounds like complete flights of fancy. Now we established already that in order to fundamentally understand the nature of reality, you need a philosophy. You need an ontology that explains the nature of reality. So why does this matter to quantum physics? Like, where does quantum physics play into this? That's what I want to get at, because we're going down the realm here of talking about philosophical notions of aeviternal reality and the intermediary and so on. That's all fine. But tell me why, what the heck does this have to do with quantum physics? I guess what I'm leading to, John, is the measurement problem. Because Wolfgang penned a beautiful book, which, if you haven't read it, you need to get it. It's called The Quantum Enigma, Finding the Hidden Key. And Wolfgang provides a resolution. He wrote this book, what, back in 1992, I think? 95. And it followed on his first book, Cosmos and Transcendence. But so he wrote it, and he provides a resolution to the quantum enigma, which is really a resolution to the very nature of our reality. And what does he propose as his resolution? First of all, what is the quantum enigma? The measurement. The measurement problem and the quantum enigma are essentially the same thing, are they not?
Mm-hmm.
You might say. I mean, there are many enigmas in quantum physics, but the central enigma is the measurement problem.
Right.
What is that? What are we talking about?
Well, when you look at the history of physics, I mean, there's just one discovery after another. You know, once the sort of methodological reductionism kicked in, despite its philosophical fallacy, nevertheless, it had a pragmatic function. You know, the thing is, from Newtonian mechanics up to Maxwell's electrodynamics, and then coming up to Max Planck discovering his constant, which paved the way to the quantum theory of Heisenberg and Schrodinger, there's sort of a stopping point.
There's a split.
There's something that happens because all of those scientific, that scientific assumption that was made all along in the classical physics tradition, when it came to quantum physics, it didn't make sense to the physicists. They were like, this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense.
Let's go back for a sec here, and let's talk about what we mean by classical physics. So first of all, physics as a scientific discipline began, let's say, it goes all the way back to Galileo, to Copernicus, to our conception of the cosmos, and it started to conceive of the cosmos as objects moving in space, following certain laws, whether it's gravity, force equals mass times acceleration. That's the classical physics, the one we learn in high school. Everybody learns it, right? Mm-hmm. And it's based on objects moving in space. And so it searches smaller and smaller objects, infinitesimal, to get as accurate as we possibly can to understand how objects move in space, until boom, we hit a point where the objects seem to disappear. But the bottom line I'm getting to is that there is a thing we call classical physics that
right.
comes to us from we inherit from Newton,
right?
His Principia, but and then we discover a physics that doesn't follow the classical notions of physics,
right?
And they essentially create a brand new physics known as quantum physics, quantum theory, and it expresses itself through Heisenberg's matrix mechanics, Schrodinger's differential equations. The fundamental issue is that there's a break between classical physics and quantum physics. Now we're in a whole new realm. Now, you might say, and this is Wolfgang's point, what the quantum physicists are doing is taking classical notions and trying to impose them onto this new quantum physics, and the result is one enigma after another. Why? Because we're not dealing with ordinary objects in the quantum realm.
Right. There's an approximation with a classical physical object. There's an approximation. I mean, it's directly derivative from a corporeal object. You know, it's just the classical object is really sort of the quantitative aspect, just all the quantitative attributes put together of a corporeal object.
Which Wolfgang talks, meaning the three-dimensionality, x1, x2, x3.
Right.
And then what time is it?
Right. And
right?
so the thing is that when they got to quantum mechanics, the reason they were puzzled is because their old bifurcationist assumption, which they didn't necessarily even know they held, didn't make sense in light of quantum theory. Quantum theory was showing, or quantum mechanics, the physics they were doing, they thought, well, this works so stupendously, but it doesn't make any sense. And the reason they think it doesn't make any sense is because they held this deeply encrusted scientific assumption of bifurcation and of the world as pure extension. I always think of, well, Wolfgang said, quantum paradox, it appears, is nature's way of repudiating a spurious philosophy, namely the Cartesian
Yes.
philosophy. One thing that I always think is from Horace. Horace said, you can throw out nature with a pitchfork, but it will come back, breaking in unexpectedly, victorious over your perverse contempt. So quantum mechanics to me seems like nature punching back. He said, it's like nature saying, okay, I've had enough. This is what the world really is like. And quantum mechanics essentially pushes us back onto philosophical ground. It pushes us
Yes.
back into the world.
Excellent.
Yeah, and this is one of the
Great
reasons
point.
that this is one of the reasons why it shows us that philosophy is necessary, ontology is necessary to and quantum mechanics has done us the favor of reminding us that we can't simply reduce everything to quantity, because I mean, without getting technical, if everything did reduce to quantum particles, quantum mechanics itself wouldn't be possible because you couldn't take measurements.
That's you made such an important point there. Um, Several important points, but the that quantum theory essentially blew apart the Cartesian postulate. And in fact, I've got a quote here from Heisenberg who addresses this issue. And a lot of people don't actually know much about Heisenberg. He's sort of a cult legend today as this a lot of fanboys of Heisenberg, right? Believing that he would support their, let's say, contemporary notions of the nature of physics, but in fact, he was a deep thinker and a philosopher, and he has a quote here that I want to read, and it's from his book on physics and philosophy, which Wolfgang provides in his book, The Quantum Enigma, from 1958, and he writes, quote, "If one follows the great difficulty which even eminent scientists like Einstein have in understanding and accepting the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory, one can trace the roots of that difficulty to the Cartesian partition. This partition has penetrated deeply into the human mind during the 3 centuries following Descartes, and it will take a long time for it to be replaced by a really different attitude toward the problem of reality." End quote. That was Werner Heisenberg pointing out that even Einstein didn't understand that he was trying to view the world, reality, through this Cartesian bifurcation between res cogitantes and res extensae. And that made it very difficult for him to understand the Copenhagen interpretation of physics. And what is the Copenhagen interpretation of physics? It's essentially a philosophical interpretation that Werner Heisenberg introduces, that he says, and this is another quote from him, perhaps it's paraphrasing, but he says that about quantum particles, that they are somewhere between being and non-being, and as such, reminiscent of Aristotelian potentiae. So they are potentiae, not tiny little objects.
One of the things that we haven't quite mentioned yet is that the whole point about bifurcation and the world of extension is mechanism. It allows the physicist to believe that he is the sole arbiter of reality. He knows what's going on. Everything is reduced to mechanical relationships and whatnot. And quantum mechanics showed that ultimately, in a nutshell, that this can't be the case. It can't be absolutely this way.
And you might even say that particles, so-called, are named misleadingly because it would give
Yes,
the impression that they're tiny little objects.
right.
And so just the language that's used to describe uh, they're very fundamental elements of our corporeal world as particles is misleading.
Right.
And this is why quantum physics is so confusing to people, because we live in a world of objects. And so when we try to understand quantum theory, we impose this understanding of our world onto quantum systems.
Yeah, and the thing about Heisenberg's introduction of what he said, was that it was Bohr and Kramers and Slater, I think I'm pronouncing those correctly, who, and this was prior to his own discovery, I think about a year before, they were doing some sort of work that didn't quite pan out, but they did make a critical discovery, which is called the probability wave. And this is what Heisenberg referred to as a strange thing sort of midway between possibility and reality. And he said that it's like a quantitative version of potentia in Aristotelian philosophy. And I think that's a crucial point to make about a quantitative version of potentia. And that because in philosophy, potentia doesn't really have a signature per se. And the quantum physicists really discovered a new stratum of nature that we didn't know about. But the thing is, and this is the way I always say it, is that when you're talking about, like you said, it's a particle in name only. Ultimately, what is a quantum? It's a probability in relation to this or that experimental result.
Right. Good.
Heisenberg defined it this way too, I think, as a tendency toward, a particular result or outcome. But without the measuring instruments, and this is what I think they have a real difficult time with understanding, is that if you have no measuring instruments, you can't do quantum physics. I mean, granted, all physics is based on measurement, but I always make the joke that I sometimes think that quantum mechanics is really a theory of measuring instruments, because without the measuring instrument, it's really the measuring instruments which bring you the result. It's not consciousness collapsing the wave function, as they like to say. It's the act of measurement.
Great point. And so this brings us to the idea of materialism. Well, if we're talking about materialism, what are we talking about? If it's a particle in name only, and it's potentiae, which means probability or potentiality or potency, that means it has the power to be something, but is not yet. And so when you talk about the word material, the root word is mater, which is a principle of receptivity in philosophy, right?
Right.
But it needs something in order to become something. It needs, and this is from Aristotelian philosophy, it needs form. It needs to be informed by something in order to form something. So what we're talking about at the level of quantum mechanics is that quanta or quantum particles exhibit a principle of receptivity to form which measurement supplies. Measurement, it meets it out. So there's a potential that measurement provides a result to. And so as you mentioned, quantum physics or physics is a theory of measuring instruments. In a sense, it's the measuring instrument that you sort of create reality. In a sense, you put it there. And the other thing is, we're also imposing limitations, not just philosophically. Obviously, if you measure something, you're necessarily imposing a limit on it, but you're also limited by the nature of the very measuring instrument. And so I wanted to introduce also another statement by Erwin Schrödinger, because I think a lot of people, this is where, Schrödinger's cat, right? Is a cat dead or alive? The Schrödinger experiment. And I think there's a lot of simplification or reduction to Erwin Schrödinger, as he is a pioneer, obviously, in the area of quantum theory, but they forget that he too was a deep thinker. And the Copenhagen interpretation has been completely dismissed by contemporary physicists. But Schrödinger said this, and this is from his book Science and Humanism, quote, "We have been compelled to dismiss the idea that such a particle is an individual entity which in principle retains its sameness forever. Quite to the contrary. We are now obliged to assert that the ultimate constituents of matter have no sameness at all. And I beg to emphasize this, and I beg you to believe it. It is not a question of our being able to assert the identity in some instances and not being able to do so in others. It is really beyond doubt that the question of sameness, of identity, really and truly has no meaning. End quote. That was Erwin Schrödinger from Science and Humanism. That is about as philosophical as things get. And he's pointing out here, these particles are not tiny objects.
And he must have been gritting his teeth writing that, because Schrödinger was one of those guys who did not want to accept quantum mechanics. And he said something to the effect, he said, if I had known that I was going to have to be dealing with all this damn jumping, like the electrons jumping from one orbit to another or whatever, however they model the atom, he said, I wish I would have never even gotten involved with it, or never would have discovered the wave equation or whatever he said. But that's the thing, is that, and certainly it speaks to the honesty of Schrödinger talking about that, because he's essentially telling you, let me tell you,
a rare quality today.
Yeah.
Honesty, a rare quality. Right?
Because he's really telling you something that he wishes weren't true,
And so this brings us back to Wolfgang. He when he starts looking into quantum theory. Now, Wolfgang was a mathematician, but also he had his master's in physics. So he started investigating what he says, this curious literature, and he comes to a conclusion about it, that in fact even Heisenberg was mistaken at one point, because there is a point at which Heisenberg sort of throws up his hands and says, well, I know it's potentiae, but I guess if you put enough of them together, they amount to something, it becomes something. And Wolfgang's saying, no, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter how many potentiaes that you stack together, they never amount to a thing. Something else is required. And in fact, he hints at this in his first book, Cosmos and Transcendence, which is recently released, and you can get it at the Philos-Sophia.org website. That's Cosmos and Transcendence. And the subtitle of that book is Breaking Through the Barrier of Scientistic Belief. But he says in there, this brings us at last to the seemingly paradoxical conclusion that the worldview associated with the most exact science is shot through with fundamental misconceptions. What we have collectively failed to grasp is that this purportedly scientific Weltanschauung, now Wolfgang uses the German word there that means how one looks out upon the world, is based not upon the legitimate findings of science, but upon hidden philosophical or a priori assumptions, which turn out in the last analysis to be self-contradictory. In the name of physics, civilization has succumbed to a fantasy. That's pretty damning.
Yeah. One thing I was going to say about Heisenberg was, this idea of that, maybe 10 to the 24th of these particles or whatever. And, you come into the domain of real things, but, despite his basic sort of understanding between the sub-existential, merely potential domain of the quantum theoretic entities and the corporeal world and corporeal objects, is again this residual atomism, which brings us back to Democritus. This notion that everything is made of atoms, or in our case, fundamental particles or what have you. And the thing about potentiality is that it is not self-activating. It must be brought into act by something which is already in act. Hence,
exactly, which makes existence or reality actually vertical in nature and not horizontal and mechanistic,
right?
Transmuted by temporal means.
And to define those terms really quickly, which I don't think we have yet, horizontal causality, what Wolfgang means by that is essentially what some may understand to be efficient causality, the relations of cause and effect. And basically, operating by a transmission of energy through space. Causes can be deterministic or random or stochastic. Stochastic meaning sort of a combination between the deterministic and the random. And this happens in time. It's temporal causality. Whereas vertical causality, which Wolfgang first discerned in his resolution of the quantum reality problem in the quantum enigma, is instantaneous. And that's what the active measurement is an instance of, is vertical causation. And it's something which interrupts the flow, if you will, of quantum physical systems in their evolution.
John, would you say that horizontal causation is analogous to the causation that we find in classical physics? In other words,
Right.
it's three-dimensional objects moving through space and time. And so Wolfgang's what he's saying is that this movement of objects through space and time didn't manifest itself, or can't manifest. It has to have a start, right? This motion, and that the very existence of these objects is predicated upon their existence, which
Right.
Is a vertical cause.
Right. Or vertically caused.
Right. So the vertical has to come first before the horizontal. And so if we're relating this back to quantum theory, you're dealing not with ordinary objects, but with potentiae. And you need an object first. You need something that exists first before you can bring this quantum potentiae into existence. So the idea that matter, or everything that exists, bubbles up from quantum fluctuations is fallacious, because what the measurement is showing us over and over and over through the collapse of the wave function is that the corporeal measuring device actually determines the nature of that which it measures.
Right.
It's a vertical act.
Right.
And there's no way for these so-called quantum particles, this potentiae, to bring themselves into being.
Right.
Because, as you said, possibility doesn't create itself. There has to be an actor in order to bring about an act.
Right. And
maybe that's not the best way to put it, but essentially the notion that stuff comes from quantum, or that things are all quantum all the time, is clearly untenable. So you talked about the notion of atomism and what atomism does to a person. And this goes back to our very talk about how it informs our worldview. If you think you're just a bunch of quantum particles or atoms or molecules, you begin to think, well, what's the meaning of anything? I mean, you question your entire worldview. And so we see, because I think this relates to what we're seeing today in the blogosphere with Jonathan Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson and so on, all talking about this, what they call the quote unquote meaning crisis. Well, the root cause of this meaning crisis really lies in a false worldview presented to us by many practitioners of science, and in particular physics and astrophysics. So it matters what you think about these things. And if you study it, you come to realize that it eventually leads to a nihilistic worldview. You become apathetic. It even makes people suicidal if they think that all they are is matter, and therefore nothing matters. Because if you think you're just matter with consciousness, because that's what the physicists holding fast to the reductionist proposition will tell you, then what's the point of anything? And what is the value proposition to our existence, to our humanity? It gets effectively reduced to zero. You come to believe that humanity is just a lucky chance of an evolutionary scenario at best, and a parasite on the natural world at worst. And so this belief lends credence to ideas about population control and so on, eugenics, and every sort of dehumanizing social proposition which have at their root this scientistic and not scientific proposition that humanity or reality is nothing more than an amalgamation or collection of fundamental particles that evolved through space and time. And it's demonstrably false. So you and I have talked about this, and really the meaning crisis didn't just evolve out of nowhere. And the meaning crisis is really it's
byproduct.
It's a result, a byproduct of a crisis of truth, and that's a big truth with a big T, meaning that this subjective realism or relativism, excuse me, that pervades our culture is really the greatest deception of our time. And it penetrates, and Wolfgang talks about this as well. And you saw this in the beginning. A lot of people, when they see the end of Quantum Reality, the documentary film featuring Wolfgang Smith, the documentary film begins with, "We all knew it was coming, political, military." And so the point being is that this worldview based on physics informs every aspect of our culture, whether it's and it creates conflict, it creates misconceptions. It's really dehumanizing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it's because it's based on a false conception of reality. And Wolfgang, especially in his latest book, Physics, A Science in Quest of an Ontology, explains, let me give you the correct ontology of physics, that in fact, this notion that we just are material with consciousness, those are my words, not his, but the notion that reality is based on physics is flawed to the core.
Right. And, this speaks to your question about, I'm the ordinary layman. Why should I care about all this? Well, this is why you should care, because if you're suffering under these false assumptions, which Wolfgang Smith has really made it his business for the last 40 years or so to dispel, you're going to end up in this kind of atoms in the void kind of world. The thing about the meaning crisis, versus a crisis of being really predicated on a truth crisis, not getting to the core. I think that meaning is psychological. It's something that has to do with more of the person, the individual, whereas truth is something ontological. And what you believe and how you think you should act, all of that is founded upon ontological truth, that truth which discloses itself to us through nature and whatnot. So yeah, if you get down to it, the meaning crisis is really addressing a secondary issue. If you're not getting back into the more fundamental questions, which are philosophical questions and metaphysical questions, then all of the quest for meaning gurus out there who are, it seems to me, operating from from a more psychology or psychologistic premise, they're kind of missing the forest for the trees. Is that how the
Well,
expression
I would
goes?
offer, yeah, a great point. And I would offer, they offer a lot of value to the discussion, I think, first of all, because
Yeah, they do though. Yeah,
they're pointing out there is a problem, and
right.
we need to address it, because it does affect people's mental health. It's affecting all areas of our society. We're coming up with um, uh, incredibly crazy notions. It's leaked into our educational system. In fact, Wolfgang is very outspoken about this very fact, that he sees this as a corruption in academia, a corruption of, we send our kids off to college and they become indoctrinated into this worldview that is fundamentally dehumanizing. So I think they are offering value in the sense they're addressing the issue head on, and they're trying to find a way out of it. But I think fundamentally, and you point this out, because their tract is psychological, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, but it's fundamentally unable to resolve the problem because they're approaching it from a Cartesian viewpoint. I can almost guarantee you that while they might talk about some sort of transcendent ideas, I'm convinced that the transcendent notion that they speak of is merely a fabrication of mind. And so I think that they are trapped still in a this Cartesian bifurcation, this view of the world as, okay, we know the world is a dangerous place, and we came from this matter, and we have this mind now that is trying to deal with the reality of ourselves, of our existence, and let's try to figure out a psychological way to deal with that, to find meaning in our existence, which ultimately is probably meaningless because we're just matter. And so they come up with transcendent concepts, but I fundamentally don't think that they acknowledge it in the sense that Wolfgang would, in the sense that there is a reality beyond matter, beyond mind.
So yeah, I think that, well, I'm not sure, positive that Vervaeke, or certainly not, I certainly don't think Pajot are per se Cartesians, but nevertheless, it's interesting that there are a lot of quote unquote innovators who think they're solving a lot of problems presented by materialism, reductionism, mechanistic philosophy, and whatnot by really just jumping to the res cogitans side of the divide. They're answering the extension problem with the other side of their, and so they're still caught in the Cartesian dualism.
Right.
And I think that it's one of the key notions, I think, of Wolfgang's work is integrality. And he talks a lot about the cosmos, and that as macrocosm and man as microcosm. And the definition of cosmos is order, you know, and it's a hierarchical order. The bottom lowers are governed by the top levels. It's there's a sort of a radical, broadly spread net of, you could say, what's fundamentally Copernicanism, the sort of the mediocrity principle upon everything, which is what gives us the whole quantum reality conundrum and whatnot, and the idea of atoms and empty space. And
That's a great way to put it. The mediocrity principle.
is that, yeah, that everything is absolutely homogeneous. And incidentally, that this whole issue of the material body and then consciousness, I mean, we've talked about this before, that consciousness as such isn't like a thing. It's, in other words, consciousness is not a substance. This is one of the problems that we get from the notion of res cogitans, of thought as such. The mind is not an idea jar. One of the great contributions, perhaps maybe the greatest contribution of the thought of Edmund Husserl, who Wolfgang admires a great deal, is called intentionality. And it's essentially consciousness, but it's directed, it's teleological. Yeah, there is consciousness. I mean, because if I'm not conscious, I'm unconscious. But all consciousness is consciousness of something. And I mentioned
Right. So
earlier,
the distinction is you really have to define, you have to be careful how you define consciousness, because I remember sitting down with Wolfgang one time, and I talked to him about consciousness. He says there's no such thing as consciousness, basically. But what he means by that is that if you're talking about consciousness as an emergent property of matter, in other words, there's quantum fluctuations that become quantum particles that become molecules, and so you have this complexity that evolves over time that gives rise to consciousness and what we perceive as being, which is really just an illusion. And so if you're talking about consciousness as this emergent property of matter, then this is really this is the Cartesian flaw. So consciousness in that sense is sorely mistaken and doesn't exist. Now, if you're talking about I'm conscious, I'm awake, that's a different connotation of the word conscious. Clearly, I'm conscious. Now there are other words like subconscious. These are psychological terms. So again, your psychology. A friend of ours says he got his degree in psychology, and he says it was basically a degree in materialism.
Exactly.
And so if you're preaching consciousness, you're preaching consciousness as an emergent property of complex matter, which we reject that entirely, and Wolfgang would reject that. Now, as far as being conscious, yes. And I want to say, just going back to lest I have besmirched Jonathan Pajot, I don't think he's a Cartesian. And Jonathan Vervaeke, the jury's still out on that.
Arguable.
I want to know what he means by his. I don't know what he means when he's talking about transcendence or Neoplatonism. So I really don't know what his notion of Neoplatonism, but it'd be an interesting discussion. Jordan Peterson, I'm pretty confident, is still in that Cartesian bifurcation, because he his his resolution is almost always psychological. He's Jungian in origin, which doesn't really acknowledge, let's say, I don't know where he is personally, so I don't want to judge him, but it seems to me when I hear him talk, he's talking about essentially that religion represents archetypes, and this is Jungian at the core. Like everything is an archetype, and it's comes out of our collective consciousness, and so on. So there again, collective consciousness, and even Peterson will admit we don't know what consciousness is. Well, I would submit that's because it doesn't exist,
Right.
and as an emergent property of matter. And this is where Wolfgang's ontology comes in, his Platonist ontology, is that it presents a new ontology that dismisses this materialist notion of consciousness as an emergent property of matter, and actually resolves the issue, and even resolves the quantum enigma.
Yeah, and one thing I would say, returning to, I mentioned Robert Sokolowski earlier, something really great he said, in defining phenomenology. I was talking about Husserl a minute ago, and this doctrine of intentionality is essentially telling us that all consciousness is consciousness of something. In other words, even imaginary things. So whether real or imaginary or remembered or whatever, it's always of something. What we're not conscious of is consciousness. Whereas in subjective idealism, that's all that we're really conscious of is our own mind. But in any case, something that Sokolowski said that was really brilliant. He said phenomenology is reason's self-discovery in the presence of intelligible objects. Now, I think this is just as well a perfect,
There's that word again, intellect, intelligible.
intelligible objects. Yeah, I think that's just as well a perfect definition of philosophy generally, which, as Philos-Sophia, we ought to discuss philosophy from time to time. I think, and I think that definition, that reason's self-discovery in the presence of intelligible objects, means that we understand ourselves based on what we understand external to ourselves. I mean, the better we know the world, the better we know ourselves. And philosophy is that activity which studies our conscious understanding of the world, our relations to it as truth, rather than the world just straightforwardly, without just mundanely, without really reflecting upon it. In other words, and this kind of brings us to, it's another way of saying, to say that it's philosophy is reason, self-discovery in the presence of intelligible objects. It's just like saying, know thyself, the Delphic injunction. This isn't just know thyself isn't just an invitation to study one's own psychology. Rather, there's a tacit correlation between knowing oneself, knowing the world, and knowing oneself. So when we analyze and articulate properties, aspects, and structures of intentionality, we are at the very same time analyzing and articulating properties, aspects, and structures of that which is intended.
Do you think, though, with that definition in mind, do you think, it seems to me that this limited, I think what appears might be a limited definition, because if we're talking about it, it almost sounds like you're describing an experiential analyzing of our environment, which can fall into the trap of the bifurcationist of, we're essentially blind and subjectively interpreting our environment around us, because there's a word in there that Sokolowski uses, which is intelligible objects, which implies an intellect that is able to perceive things. So it's not just a matter of us blindly going about our environment and experiencing it and then reinterpreting it through our reasoning mind.
Right.
Certainly reason plays a role, but there's an intellect there, an intuition that evokes understanding.
Well, you're right.
Not just, yeah.
You're right. And it's funny you should say intuition, because in the phenomenological jargon, intuition, if I have an intuition of something, it's not something in my head. It's experiencing the direct presence of something.
Which implies an I that is able to
It's an
experience
intellect.
it.
It's really intellective. It's an intellective experience,
Right.
really. It's just my sheer experiencing. And as you said, there is, well, I think you may have implied this, which would be correct, is that there's a passive reception. There's also an active, well, intending, which really means meaning. It's like, because when I look at my coffee cup, I mean it as a coffee cup. I don't just see it as some mysterious thing. I mean, forms are everywhere, especially with artificial forms like books and cups and computers. We intend them in the sense that we mean them, or we understand them. I
Well,
mean,
it's the ability, you hit on forms, right? The intellect is able to pick up on forms. And this is
exactly.
what actually James J. Gibson's theory of ecological perception demonstrated. And we can come back to him later, but and this is essential to Wolfgang's work, pointing out that we do not go blindly about the world feeling our way through objects and then subjectively reasoning what they are, that they objectively exist, and there's a participation between the perceived and the perceiver. And not only that, but there's an activity in which the object presents itself and we are able to pick up on the qualities of that object and experience them. But Gibson doesn't quite go far enough, in the sense that when you go back to the ancient notion that there's a distinction between intellect and reason, and the two interplay, the intellect is able to perceive and intuit things, to understand things, which then leads to the reasoning mind going further into that understanding and in discursive thought. But the intellect doesn't require time or reason or discursive thought. It just immediately apprehends, it knows, it recognizes forms. And this is what's missing from the bifurcationist notion, this split duality that we're essentially going through space and time blind and subjectively experiential things and collecting data, and the data is interpreted and presents an image in our heads of what things are. So a lot of work in the essential notion that we're beings that collect data and interpret it and spit out outputs of perceived objects, but it's absent the idea of intellect.
Yeah.
So you and I had a discussion a while back about Neoplatonism, and because there's Platonism and Neoplatonism, and everyone has maybe their own interpretation of it. But one of the things I did is I wanted to look up a definition for Neoplatonism, and I came across an author who was a Princeton professor writing in the Stanford Encyclopedia describing Neoplatonism. Now, he made a fatal flaw in there, which I realized that this is how modernists conceive of Plato, and why analytical philosophy in particular is unable to understand Plato, because it's predicated on the materialist notion. So what he said, what this author wrote in there, this Princeton professor, is that he comes across Plato's conception of nous, which he says, and I'm paraphrasing, can be loosely translated as intellectus, but since we don't know what that means, we'll just call it consciousness. Now, right away, you completely don't understand Plato. As soon as you reduce nous and intellectus to consciousness, you've obliterated Plato.
Right.
And so it makes sense to me that if this is how you're reading Plato, then you of course you're going to relegate him to one of the, Plato had some nice ideas and we read him, but ultimately he was wrong. But that's only if you're reinterpreting Plato's ideas in a modernist term, that nous or intellectus is just consciousness.
Yeah, and there's a lot of this problem in our time of reading ancient thinkers in light of modern categories. C.S. Lewis said something to the effect that one of the greatest errors in history is to place this or that thinker on this or that side of a divide, which was not present to their mind at all.
Right. In other words, let's say Plato was trying to tell you something, and then someone comes along 2,500 years later and says, well, let me tell you what Plato really meant.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
explain this.
There's a friend of ours who described modernity, like the Enlightenment, basically, as a kind of apocalyptic event. And and I made the quip that I think he actually agreed with, that really we are living in a kind of post-apocalyptic world. And his point with that was that there are entire ways of seeing that were lost with the dawn of really, you could say with the dawn of mathematical physics. One could also say modern political philosophy, but that's outside our purview. One of the things that, philosophy students and professors do now, I mean, they think like the whole point of in reading Plato is like extracting the arguments from the dialogues and seeing if they're valid and all of this, whereas
Right.
really,
This is the analytical philosophy,
yeah,
right?
the
Analytical,
the
right.
Anglo-American tradition, right? Which follows very much from Immanuel Kant, and then logical positivism.
Well, as soon as you do that, you're obliterating philosophy. And this is why the foundation, the initiative is called Philos, or really Philo, love, Sophia, love of wisdom. But as soon as you turn it into an analytical process, you've obliterated philosophy and turned it into a positivistic discipline. So really the two terms are contradictory.
Well, and also, philosophy isn't per se in its authentic sense. And that's why I think that the initiative is properly named, because as opposed to just the philosophy initiative, because by legend, at least, according to legend, at least, it was Pythagoras who coined this term, Philos-Sophia, and it was with great purpose, because he wanted to distinguish he and his folk from the Sophos, the so-called wise man, or wise men. And he said, well, we wouldn't pretend to be wise, because only God is wise. Well, I mean, I know Socrates said that, but I'm pretty sure that may originate with Pythagoras, but there's no reason why he wouldn't say that.
But this is the tradition that Wolfgang comes out of,
right? My point with this, though, is that Pythagoras, what he coined, Philos-Sophia, is really an idiom in ancient Greek. It's not a term. Well, it is a term, but it's a love of wisdom as opposed to a subject.
You're onto something here, which I think, right. So exactly, the academia has turned philosophy into a positivistic discipline, especially when you call it analytical philosophy. Now, if you go back, as you're saying, Philos-Sophia or Philos-Sophia, which is a love of wisdom, it's really an approach to knowing.
Exactly.
As opposed to, whereas in a positivistic discipline such as modern science, which itself it certainly has its uses. It's given us many wonderful technologies and cures and so on. But it's an approach that says the only way of knowing is through positivistic discipline, through measurement, through observation, and so on. So taking a positivistic approach to philosophy completely misunderstands philosophy by the very nature of its name. And so, and I think this is where we need to reintroduce Wolfgang, because the reason why he called it the Philos-Sophia initiative is because it's expressive of his approach, where he talks about approaching a topic with humility, what he calls with folded hands. Right. In other words, being open to knowledge, being humble to what can I learn, instead of analyzing it and being, because he talks about the fact that in academia we're trained to be skeptics of everything. But in fact, what Philos-Sophia does, what his approach is, no, we need to be open. You need to humble yourself to be open to learn. And so let's talk a little bit about Wolfgang Smith, because we really haven't introduced this man. Professor Wolfgang Smith is the subject of the hit documentary The End of Quantum Reality, which you can get at theendofquantumreality.com. I encourage you to go watch that video. It's about Wolfgang and his resolution to the quantum enigma. He's also the author of many must-read books, several of which you can get and should get for you and your friends if you want to dispel of the scientistic notion in our prevalent Western civilization. And we'll include a link on the podcast. These books written by Wolfgang include Cosmos and Transcendence, Breaking the Barrier of Scientific Belief, The Vertical Ascent from Particles to the Tripartite Cosmos and Beyond, and his latest must-read, Physics, A Science in Quest of an Ontology. Wolfgang was born in 1930 in Vienna, Austria. He and his family basically escaped both the Nazi and Soviet invasions and emigrated to New York City in 1939. And as a youngster, he was always deep in thought And he related that he wanted to study physics because he felt that physics held the key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Now, he said that since then he's changed his mind. He met Albert Einstein at the age of 14, and by the age of 15 was accepted into Cornell University, graduating at the age of 18 with degrees in mathematics, physics, and philosophy. Wolfgang went on to pursue and earn his master's degree in physics from Purdue and a doctorate in mathematics from Columbia University. He worked for Bell Aircraft Corporation, part of his time spent on the space reentry problem. He later taught mathematics at MIT, UCLA, and Oregon State University. He lives in Southern California and is quickly approaching the age of 93. And both you and I, John, would call Wolfgang a dear friend. He's a true gentleman. He's so unique because it's like talking to someone from a different era. Well, because he is from a different era, but
different world.
It's like going back in time. When you talk to him, he's a gentleman from old world Vienna, and he exudes kindness and patience, and he's just a wonderful man to be around. Number one, but number two, he's an incredible thinker, and he opens a world to you that you didn't even know existed. And so we would encourage everyone, if you can, get his books. Now, one story Wolfgang relates is that on his application to Cornell, he wrote that he wanted to study physics because he believed it held the keys to unlocking the secrets of the universe. But what he encountered is what we were talking about, is this analytic philosophy at university. And he was repulsed by it, essentially. Coming from old world Austria, he thought, this is not love of wisdom. This is the opposite of that. And during his time there, he encountered the Patanjali, this poetry of a Hindu mystic, which led him on a decades-long sojourn into the Vedantic religion with all of its mystical depth. And before the Beatles made it popular, he left for India and spent months in the Himalayas amongst Indian sadhus, staying at Hindu monasteries and learning all that he could, even learning to read Sanskrit. And he says that when he returned from India, he was no longer a Western man, which is to say, he did not ascribe to the strictly positivistic worldview, you might say, given to us since the so-called Enlightenment. And he came to understand that the world, the universe, the cosmos was far deeper and mysterious than our positivistic scientific sages could tell us. Now, John, Wolfgang is a scientist, right?
Right.
And a very good one, but he's also a deeply Platonist thinker. And he spent years of his free time immersed in the works of Plato when he wasn't teaching mathematics to university students. And so this is the approach he took when he encountered what he calls this curious literature of quantum theory. And so the approach he took was a Platonist viewpoint of understanding what was going on in the measurement problem. And so he picks up with Werner Heisenberg and his commentary about quantum systems being reminiscent of Aristotelian potentiae, somewhere between being and non-being. And it was this simple observation that opened the door to Wolfgang to understand and resolve the quantum enigma, also known as the measurement problem. And what he says is understanding it in a new key. In short, that if quantum particles are somewhere between being and non-being and reminiscent of Aristotelian potentiae, then that is what they are, essentially. And so-called quantum particles prior to measurement are potentiae. They are potency prior to measurement. When measured, they are in act. At measurement, they are given a kind of existence by the measuring device. Would you say that's accurate?
They receive their existence by becoming a part of the measuring system. They don't have an existence of their own. It's the physical is always parasitic upon the corporeal.
So basically, you might say that a physical system occupies a lower strata of being.
Exactly.
Prior to measurement, and another strata of being, a higher, following or during the act of measurement. There's a transition, a jump from a purely physical system, the world described by the physicists, a lesser ontological realm of potency, somewhere between being and non-being, a jump to a corporeality, the world of being in which we live and move and have our existence and our experience. And the reason why the documentary is called The End of Quantum Reality is because we do not live in that world of physics. We live in a corporeal world. We don't live in a quantum world. The physics
Right.
world is an abstraction built essentially to serve the needs of the physicist, the experimental physicist. But the corporeal world, the world that we live in, is completely different. And it expresses wholeness,
Right.
what Wolfgang calls an irreducible wholeness. So the physics is a description of partitions that can neither describe being nor generate being. It's a reduction.
Right.
Wolfgang is quoted as saying that the famous Niels Bohr Albert Einstein debate, which led to the Copenhagen interpretation, that no one on either side of this debate seemed to have realized that it is the role of quantum particles not to bestow, but to receive being. So this simple observation reverses the assumption of contemporary physicists who embrace reductionism. It's a wholesale refutation of the reductionist proposition. Because if, as Heisenberg said, quantum particles are mere potency prior to measurement, somewhere between being and non-being, then it doesn't matter how many potencies you put together, they will never amount to a thing. Something else is required. First of all, to bring about the existence of a quantum particle to the level of the corporeal, to the level of the observable, the perceptible. Because prior to measurement, they're not perceptible, but at the moment of measurement, now we can perceive it. So it's an ontological jump. And so something else is required to obtain or manifest being on a level in which we experience, which is the ontological level of the corporeal. And so Wolfgang makes this distinction between the world of physics and the world in which we actually exist and have an experience, which is the corporeal. And so he reintroduces this notion of a corporeal existence.
Right. And this thing about the quantum reality problem and the end of quantum reality, people talk about interpretations of quantum mechanics. That's the big thing. To me, though, with Wolfgang, it's really no question of interpretation here. This is resolution to a problem. It's only an interpretation if one is positing the corporeal world as merely hypothetical. Bifurcation, physicalism, atomism, these are all different aspects of one misconception, namely that there's no ontological hierarchy in the world. And Wolfgang is simply unpacking the implications of how quantum physics must be understood if the corporeal world is as it appears to be. If the corporeal world is not a conjecture but a fact, then there's really only one way we can understand quantum theory. And Wolfgang is simply telling us how all these elements fit together necessarily, if there is in fact to be a bona fide distinction between the physical and the corporeal, or between physical and corporeal objects. And one thing I would point out, which I've been meaning to point out, is that it really is remarkable that to break the Cartesian dualism, the divide, all that is necessary, the only philosophic presupposition that you need to have is that the world as you perceive it by your senses, by a sensory perception, is a real world. Because in doing so, you've reintroduced qualities, which means that there's more than just quantities. In other words, it's not just a world of extension. You've also been taken out of the idea jar of quote unquote consciousness, or mere thought. So this one thing,
Right.
this one notion, corporeality, just basically and it's a very simple, it's really, it's, as we said earlier, it's self-evident. If you accept this one self-evident truth, it's like breaking you out of a philosophical, or like what one philosopher calls the egocentric predicament, is one way of putting it. But it's more than that. It's not just the egocentric predicament, it's also the mechanist predicament, the physicalist problem. So you really break both sides of bifurcation by this one assumption, And it really doesn't even have to be assumed. It just has to be accepted that things are as they appear, and they appear as they are.
Well, you really have to go through mental gymnastics to assert that you're just a conglomerate of particles.
Yes.
And in fact, I had this debate online with someone who insisted that reality is all quantum all the time. If that's the case, then literally things are all quantum all the time. That means there's no you, there's no I, there's no nothing. It's just there's a now you might say, well, yeah, because it's all an illusion. But no, there's not even an illusion, because there has to be someone to have an illusion. If things are all quantum all the time, then that's all there is. There is nothing else. So it's essentially self-refuting. It makes no sense.
Exactly. I mean, if it were all an illusion, if all is quantum, as people like this contend, and it's all therefore an epiphenomenon, an illusion, we should never have been able to discover that we were in an illusion. Because
Exactly.
how did we get out of the how did we see beyond the river that we're immersed in?
You can't even, if things are all quantum all the time, you can't even do physics
to even know
you
that.
Can't even, there isn't even a discovery of physics, because
right,
all there is quantum.
You have to be able to step outside of a boundary in order to see what the boundaries are. And that's the way you said it's self-refuting.
It reminds me of an article I read, the particle collection that fancied itself a physicist. So in other words, to take to take the reductionist proposition, effectively what you're saying is that there are quantum particles, they're things, first of all, quantum particles that believe themselves to be someone who believes themselves to be quantum particles. It's totally absurd.
Yeah.
This is why we need philosophy, and good philosophy.
One of the things that with the end of quantum reality, spoiler alert, I love, what's not really that much of a spoiler alert because it occurs within like the first 2 minutes of the film. Olavo de Carvalho said, Eddington said that, you think this is a table, but in fact, it's just a bunch of particles. I said, well, you can invert this. You see this bunch of particles, you think it's a bunch of particles, but in fact, it's a table. So it's kind of how do you want to look at it? Which, and Wolfgang describes the physical universe as the corporeal world as conceived by the physicist. And it's an important methodological mindset. I mean, you have to look like that to do physics. But where scientism comes in is when you try to insist that this is in fact how things are, and that the fundamental basis of existence is these fundamental particles, or quantum bubbles, or whatever the
you end up in what he calls the reductio ad absurdum.
Right.
It's a philosophical fallacy where you end up into
an absurd solution,
into absurdity.
Right.
Yeah. And this leads us to scientific conclusions about the nature of our reality. The number one scientific conclusion is that we reduce to particles, the sum of parts. You were going to say, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, you remarked about the need for philosophy. The thing about philosophy is you can either, one, accept philosophy as a reality of the human condition and consciously examine your own philosophical assumptions, presuppositions, or two, you can pretend like philosophy is of no consequence, whilst being unconsciously held hostage by somebody else's philosophy or your own unexamined philosophical presuppositions, such as that, for instance, what makes science of value is its production of empirical results.
Right. And Wolfgang talks about this. He says, he's always surprised by these people that claim that metaphysics is a waste of time, essentially, or essentially giving you their metaphysical belief.
Yeah. He says somewhere, I find that those who tend to disparage metaphysics the most tend to be true to their own.
Right.
you know,
Right.
incidentally, this relationship between physics and philosophy, which, which Wolfgang really considers to be an important relationship. I mean, I think he sees them as sort of complementary endeavors. And I think that's in particular because in modernity, they are, because obviously we didn't have physics forever. And then we did, 400 years ago. And physics, it's not like it's a necessity. And in some ways, it's because of the ways that it's distorted by fallacious, bad metaphysical assumptions. It ends up becoming almost not worth the conveniences it gives us from a philosophical point of view. But the fact that physics works, unlike what people like Stephen Hawking, Lawrence Krauss, and Neil deGrasse Tyson would say, the fact that physics works, by no means does that discredit philosophy. There's this idea that, like, oh, well, philosophy was good until we had physics and started taking measurements and whatnot. And in fact, only by way of this particular philosophical assumption, in this case, the world may be reduced to quantity alone. It's this philosophical assumption that made modern physics possible to begin with. It was a philosophical assumption. So,
Right.
but the fact is that, as Wolfgang says in the film, paradigms outlive their usefulness, which is what happened with the entry of with quantum mechanics. It's kind of hit the end of the road with what physics could really tell
Right.
us.
Quantum theory is nature's way of repudiating a spurious philosophy.
Right.
And the spurious philosophy he's talking about is this Cartesian dilemma, this bifurcation.
Right.
And so when you say so obviously physics works. There's no contesting that.
Yeah.
The reason you and I are talking is because quantum physics works. So the criticism being offered is not of physics,
right,
but of the metaphysics that come from the speculation of physicists trying to understand how it works. And so the battle is not between physics and metaphysics, but between good metaphysics and bad metaphysics.
Yeah, and that was something Heisenberg said too, that good science being corrupted by bad philosophy.
When you said something poignant or important, is that Wolfgang sees an important link between physics and philosophy, which is really, when I introduced the Philos-Sophia initiative as kicking this off, is the initiative, quote, aims to facilitate a recovery of the vertical aspect of cosmic reality. In other words, inviting people to an encounter with a comprehensive worldview that integrates the fundamental discoveries of physics. So physics is A-okay. We love physics.
Yeah.
But integrating that into the perennial wisdom of mankind. In other words, it needs an ontology to understand it well.
Exactly.
And for Wolfgang, that ontology is Platonist, properly understood.
Right. Yeah. And what's remarkable about Wolfgang's work is that he has shown that this can be done, that the fundamental discoveries of physics, the valid discoveries of physics, can in fact fit hand in glove with the perennial wisdom of mankind. There's not a conflict here.
There's not a conflict, though. It's actually, you might say, it's the only way to explain it. As soon as you divorce physics from the perennial wisdom of mankind, you end up with scientism. You end up with a lot of crazy notions like multiverses.
That's a good point.
Where you're trying, what he talks about, the Procrustean notion, you're trying to squeeze observations into a metaphysic that fundamentally misinterprets how the cosmos is actually structured. So, for example, the math tells us in quantum theory that a probabilistic nature that leads to unknown outcomes. In order to justify these outcomes, we have to justify how a universe even came to come to existence in the first place. So the bottom line is that the multiverse or many worlds concept is derived from mathematical precepts. So in
Mm.
order for us to account for the existence of the universe, we have to apply these mathematical precepts to suppose that, well, everything obeys the math. Therefore, in order for a universe to come into existence, it must happen probabilistically. And this probabilistic notion leads to an infinite number of multiverses popping into existence at any given moment, because that's what happens at the quantum level. And the macro has to obey the micro.
Right.
But this is fundamentally misconceived because
Right.
you've divorced physics from an ontology, and you're basically, well, we've talked about this notion that it's fundamentally impossible. What the measurement problem is showing is that it's fundamentally impossible for potentiae to realize anything without being realized by something that already exists.
Right. Something I mentioned a minute ago, this thing that Wolfgang sort of considers philosophy and physics to be sort of, they go together in a way. I think this is in the face of what I was getting at before, was like, in the face of what we are today in the modern situation, you have to take physics into account, because as we said earlier, culture is downstream of physics. People like me who come from a humanities background, I really wish that weren't the case. I really do. But I accept it. I've come to accept that it is, and you have to just, one has to deal with it.
But you raised an important point, because that's a really good question. Why are two laypersons educated in the humanities sitting here talking about quantum theory? Well, because it matters to everyday Joes to
Right.
understand, okay, fine, you and I can't do the math, let's say, right? We're not quantum physicists. But the point is not that we can't perform physics. The point is, like, what does the physics mean? We want to know, we can trust the math. There's a peer review process to say if there's an error somewhere in the math, they're going to find it. But we want to know what it means. And so fundamentally, what we're presented, the worldview that we're presented, doesn't match necessarily the science. And this is Wolfgang pointing this out. And so we as laypersons can actually understand the physics on a philosophical level, on a metaphysical level, to say that, well, no, this actually, what I'm given as this reductionist scenario of my existence is actually false. And this means a lot to people, especially if you want to go back to the meaning crisis that says we're just matter with consciousness. Well, it obliterates that paradigm and says, no, you matter. You actually have a transcendent reality about you that goes beyond merely the material, merely the corporeal level. But it also means something else, is that there's a potential for a whole area of science to be explored that isn't being explored because it's being limited to these materialist notions of particle physics, which have yet to really provide us with, after billions and billions of dollars spent on particle physics, there's really nothing new under the sun. We haven't been given any new technologies per se out of churn that have derived us any value. So there's a whole area that's not being looked at, potentially this area between the physical and the corporeal, that isn't being explored, but could be.
Yeah, it is true that we, especially in the modern West, we placed limits on our self-imposed limits on our comprehension, which prevents us from seeing. And Wolfgang, I'm quoting Wolfgang here, something he said one time. Nature answers to our way of seeing. And one of the points that he makes in general is that with the discovery of vertical causality, well, first of all, as I mentioned before, with vertical causation, nature told us through quantum measurement that we hit the end of the road with respect to answers yielded by horizontal causality alone. We can seek more answers, and nature will keep supplying them depending on how we look. But if we insist on continuing to look the way we've been looking, we're not going to be getting more answers, just more nonsensical and untestable hypotheses, ad hoc this, ad hoc that. And if the vertical dimension is not incorporated into how we read nature, we'll just keep wandering through Eliot's wilderness of mirrors.
Right. Well, you get more multiverses, which
Right.
are like, as you said, they're untestable hypothesis. But when you run into an untestable hypothesis, what do? Well, you say, well, let's get rid of falsification because it's limiting us. Well, no, falsification is still a necessary part of science. You're no longer participating in the scientific act. Now you're engaged in metaphysics.
Something that Wolfgang gives us, which we haven't really had for 400 years, is this authentic cosmology, tripartite cosmology. And I mentioned before about, for someone like me, it's a difficult truth to accept, but your cosmological vision, the cosmological vision that we presupposed, what C.S. Lewis referred to actually as kind of an imaginative backdrop, sort of forms the backdrop of the arts and literature, etc. And which we're taught in schools and we read about in the science press and the pop sci books. It has a direct effect on how we view ourselves. You were talking about earlier, it's like, why does this matter to us? And our immediate world, not to mention our religious life, personal life, these issues in the empiriological sciences, cosmology, physics, and whatnot, as I used to myself believe, that, it doesn't really have any bearing on our ontological preoccupations. It doesn't really matter. But again, like I said, unfortunately, well, it's not necessarily unfortunate. It's just from my point of view, like I said, it's a fact one has to accept that you have this cosmological backdrop. And the same is true of those whose main haunts are literature, history, or what have you. But, if we reflect critically on our own thinking, we will discover a tendency to try to accommodate our philosophic and artistic proclivities to what we are told are the so-called hard facts of science. And the lion's share of these so-called facts are in the rather regrettable position of not being facts at all. What they really are is byproducts of certain metaphysical presuppositions. And again, once again, chief among them being bifurcation, through which the actual facts have been erroneously interpreted. And so this is exactly what Wolfgang means by scientism. That is ideology, really an ideology masquerading in a scientific garb. In most of what passes for capital S science in our time, we might be able to sift out one scientific fact for every 10 scientific fallacies. And I think that Wolfgang's paradigm, it's really when it gets into your bones, it's really a very useful heuristic for this task of separating out the wheat from the chaff,
Uh, Absolutely brilliant points. And, you know, I think what you can take from that also, you said something really key there, and I'm paraphrasing from my memory, that what we think about the world is how we think about ourselves. And this is really important because there's two ways to approach it. One is you accept everything told to you by the physics world, right? That you're just a bunch of particles existing in space and time, and there's really no meaning to anything. You're going to die, you're going to expire. Nothing really means, everything is illusion. You might think, well, I live in a simulation. You come up with all kinds of fantastical notions. Or the other alternative is to say, okay, well, that's what the scientists say. I guess what they're saying is true, but I'm going to go live over here in my reality. And so you're sort of, you exist in two worlds where nothing really, you kind of split down the middle, where things don't seem to make sense in your world, because you have a world in which you live and experience, and you think are intellectual experiences and thoughts and dreams and love and beauty and song, all of these things that are part of your existence. Yet the scientific world is telling you, well, on this side, none of it means anything. It's just a bunch of stuff and it's all illusion. And so you're split down the middle, and if you're going to believe in the scientific notions that tell you the way things are, you're not integrated. You
Exactly.
feel like there's something wrong, but you have to ignore reality. If you feel like you're living in a pretend world. And Wolfgang, what's unique about him is, as you said, he provides or presents an integrality. He says, no, this isn't necessary. Right. Because what you're being presented with is not science, it's scientism. Right. You can still practice good science and hold on to your traditional worldview. They're not incompatible. In fact, they're complementary.
Right. Truth cannot contradict truth, as the old saying goes. If you find that what has been held to be true for eons, you're suddenly told by these guys, in lab coats and spectacles that, oh no, you can't believe that anymore. You can't believe that anymore. Maybe it's them that have something wrong. I mean, their findings can be trusted, but they still interpret their findings. And this is something that George Ellis, the great cosmologist, talks about a lot. He really criticizes people like that ilk who talk about, the stupidity of philosophy and whatnot. And he says, that it's so ridiculous that they say that, because then they go on and engage in all kinds of terrible philosophy themselves. It's like it would do them some good to read some of the classics and some of the contemporary philosophers of science and whatnot. But George Ellis is a rare bird.
He is. And you might ask the question, well, why would I go back and read all those classics if it's all illusion anyway?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is what you end up with, is this idea that, well, everything that came before, we know so much more now. And so, they're nice. It might be beautiful literature and we can appreciate it for that, but that's all it is. It's nice. It doesn't really present us with any truth that we can work with, because we know what truth is. It's presented to us by the scientific community in the form of measurements and their interpretation thereof. And they give us the worldview. And that's the only one there is. So it's a difficult spot that we're in. And Wolfgang really presents us with an integrated way of looking at physics that brings back in that traditional worldview and shows that, in fact, they're complementary. We can dispel with all of these scientistic notions. And I think
And keep
his book,
science.
and keep science. Exactly.
Yeah.
We can keep doing science and
Yeah.
keep doing physics. And in fact, open up a
Well,
whole new avenue in science.
Yeah. Not only that, yeah, we can keep science, and like you said, open up a whole new avenues, especially in light of, vertical. If there's ever, hopefully the day will come when there's a recognition of vertical causation. I know at least one scientist in our circle who vertical causation plays a pivotal role in his research in biology, in DNA. So we get to keep science and remain sane, and we don't have to just throw out our favorite books. I mean, our the Lord of the Rings and my Aristotle and
well, the
my
beautiful thing about
philosophy
it's
books
funny you
don't.
mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the Lord of the Rings. His books are very Platonist, which is something that Peter Kreeft brings up.
Yeah.
Himself a Platonist philosopher, but she demonstrates how those books are. So Plato wins again, as our friend would say. So we should probably wrap this up, John. I think what we're showing essentially is this integrality that Wolfgang has presented. Wolfgang talks about this integrality in his new book, Physics, A Science in Quest of Ontology. You can get it at the Philos-Sophia website at philos-sophia.org. You can get it now. Also, look out for some interviews Wolfgang's going to be a part of potentially. We might see him on with Kurt Jai-Mungal. John, you may be on with him on a show coming up called Footnotes to Plato, potentially. So we're going to be discussing these themes. Wolfgang will be presenting his Platonist ontology and talking about the book. So be on the lookout for that. And there's another part of the initiative, which is, I guess you could say, is an initiative within the initiative, which is the Project Schola. John, what's Project Schola about?
Well, part of it is what we're doing here, which is, as time goes by, we want to unpack, introduce Wolfgang's ideas to, more people through this kind of means. We hope to have on friends of ours who are scholars and who friends of Wolfgang in different fields, So we're going to be having guests, and ultimately the Schola project, it's a long-term, you could say, educational outreach endeavor. this is what we're doing here on this podcast is just sort of a prelude. Hopefully, we'll just sort of get the conversation started. And the goal is we want to have a kind of organized learning apparatus, like an online academy of some kind. But ultimately, the Philos-Sophia initiative, founding long-term mission, is really kind of a youth outreach. It's not like it's really for anyone, but it's probably the target age is probably would be 15 to 25, something like that.
In particular, we want to reach the youth. The initiative does, because young minds especially are so easily formed and easily corrupted. So Project Schola, the term Schola, John, you pointed out this to me from one of your favorite books on philosophy that you gave me. Schola is what we term leisure. It's this leisure, not in the sense of sitting on the beach with a pina colada, but leisure in terms of this is a time that you spend when you're not working. This is a time you spend in study of philosophy, and studying,
right,
in becoming more human, becoming more of who you're meant to be. And so Project School is precisely that. It provides, it's designed, or the effort of the initiative is designed to provide a fruitful enterprise for people to go deeper into their humanity, to understand this connection between the perennial traditions of mankind as it relates to the discoveries in physics, so we can come up with a holistic view of our humanity, our place, and our purpose in this world.
Well, for one thing, you have to realize Wolfgang really has what you could call a transcendental perspective. I mean, he understands and has experienced East and West, ancient and modern, math, physics, philosophy. He's really kind of like at the center point of all these different areas, and his work is really a great point of departure for a broader philosophical education. And I think that that's the kind of thing we want to pursue with our education outreach.
Great stuff. So once again, go to philos-sophia.org, get Wolfgang's latest book, Physics, A Science in Quest of an Ontology. You can also rent the movie, The End of Quantum Reality, at theendofquantumreality.com. The links will also be included here in the post for this podcast. Join us again. Once again, my name is Brian Murphy, and John Trevor Berger signing off. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.